September 4th, 1985. 3:15 p.m. Malpaso Productions office, Burbank. Harrison Ford sat across from Clint Eastwood in the legendary actor-director's Spartan office, surrounded by posters from Dirty Harry and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. At 43, Harrison was at the peak of his career, having conquered both science fiction and adventure films. But Clint Eastwood, at 55, represented something Harrison had never fully mastered: the American Western hero. What Harrison didn't know was that this meeting would ignite the most philosophically important rivalry in modern action cinema, a battle between two fundamentally different approaches to heroism that would influence every action movie made for the next 20 years. "So Ford," Eastwood said in that famous whisper-quiet voice, not bothering with pleasantries, "I hear you're interested in making a Western." Harrison had come to discuss The Man from Laramie, a script that both actors were being courted for, a gritty story about two former Civil War soldiers forced to work together to survive in the lawless frontier. It was the kind of morally complex Western that could showcase both men's talents while revitalizing a genre that had been dormant since the 1970s. "That's right, Clint. I think there's room for Westerns to make a comeback, especially if we approach them with the same kind of character depth and emotional stakes that work in other genres." Eastwood leaned back in his chair, studying Harrison with the same cold intensity that had made him famous in spaghetti westerns. "Character depth," he repeated slowly. "Emotional stakes. That's very contemporary of you." There was something in Eastwood's tone that immediately put Harrison on guard. It wasn't quite mockery, but it wasn't respect either. It was the sound of a master craftsman questioning whether an upstart understood the fundamentals of the trade. "I'm not sure what you mean by that, Clint." "I mean," Eastwood said, his voice dropping even lower, "that you think playing space cowboys makes you ready for the real thing. The West isn't about running from explosions or swinging from ropes. It's about standing your ground when everything else runs away." The challenge was unmistakable. Eastwood was essentially arguing that Harrison's success in Star Wars and Indiana Jones had nothing to do with the skills required for authentic Western filmmaking. It was a direct attack on Harrison's credibility as an action star. Harrison felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "Clint, I've been making action movies for 8 years. I understand character, I understand stakes, and I understand what audiences want from their heroes." "Do you?" Eastwood asked, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked the studio lot. "Because what I see when I watch your movies is a lot of running, a lot of talking, and a lot of luck. That's not what Western heroes are made of." The insult was perfectly calibrated. Eastwood was reducing Harrison's entire career to cowardice and chance, suggesting that his approach to heroism was fundamentally incompatible with the Western genre. "And what are Western heroes made of?" Harrison asked, his patience beginning to fray. Eastwood turned back to face him, his pale eyes cold and measuring. "Silence, stillness, the ability to make hard choices without needing to explain them to anyone. Western heroes don't crack jokes when they're in danger, and they sure as hell don't need other people to save them." The philosophical divide couldn't have been clearer. Eastwood believed in the archetypal Western hero, taciturn, morally ambiguous, and utterly self-reliant. Harrison represented a newer kind of hero, collaborative, emotionally accessible, and willing to show vulnerability. "Clint," Harrison said, standing to meet Eastwood's challenge, "maybe that worked in 1960, but audiences today want heroes they can relate to. They want to see characters who are human, who make mistakes, who need help sometimes. They don't want some emotionless gunslinger who solves everything with violence. Is that what you think Western heroes are?" Eastwood's voice remained quiet, but there was steel underneath it. "Emotionless gunslingers. You really don't understand the genre at all, do you?" Harrison realized he had walked into a trap. Eastwood wasn't just defending his own approach to Westerns, he was defending the entire philosophical foundation of the genre itself. "Then explain it to me," Harrison said, deciding to go on the offensive. "Explain to me why your version of heroism is superior to mine." Eastwood smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because my heroes earn their victories through character, not luck. They face their problems head-on, instead of running away. They accept responsibility for their actions instead of making jokes about them, and when they kill someone, it costs them something." The accusation was devastating. Eastwood was arguing that Harrison's heroes were fundamentally shallow, that their victories were unearned, and their conflicts were inconsequential. "That's interesting, Clint," Harrison replied, his voice growing harder. "Because what I see in your movies is heroes who are so emotionally shut down that the audience can't connect with them. They're not strong, they're just empty. They don't face their problems, they shoot them. And they don't grow or change because they're too rigid to learn anything." The counterattack hit its mark. Harrison was arguing that Eastwood's heroes were psychologically stunted, unable to form meaningful relationships or experience genuine emotional growth. Eastwood was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was dangerous. "You know what your real problem is, Ford. You're afraid of silence. You're afraid of letting a moment breathe, of trusting that the audience is smart enough to understand what's happening without you explaining it to them. And you know what your problem is?" Harrison shot back. "You're so afraid of showing emotion that you've convinced yourself that coldness is the same thing as strength. Your heroes don't inspire people, they intimidate them. What happened next would define not just their relationship, but their competing visions of American heroism for decades to come." "Let me tell you something about Westerns," Eastwood said, walking back to his desk and picking up the script they had come to discuss. "The West was built by people who did what needed to be done without asking for permission or approval. They didn't need committees, they didn't need backup, and they sure as hell didn't need to be liked." "That's exactly the problem," Harrison responded. "That lone wolf mentality is a fantasy. Real heroism is about working with others, building communities, protecting people who can't protect themselves. Your version of the West is just a power fantasy for people who are afraid of interdependence." The philosophical battle lines were now fully drawn. Eastwood represented individualism, self-reliance, and moral ambiguity. Harrison championed collaboration, emotional vulnerability, and clear moral distinctions between right and wrong. "You want to know why Westerns died out in the 70s? Eastwood asked. "Because people like you started making them. You took away the edge, the danger, the moral complexity that made them interesting. You turned them into family-friendly adventures where nobody really gets hurt and everybody learns a valuable lesson." "No," Harrison replied firmly. "Westerns died out because they stopped evolving. They got stuck in this mythology of the strong, silent hero who solves everything with violence. Audiences got tired of characters who couldn't grow or change or show any depth beyond squinting at the horizon." The argument was escalating beyond a simple creative disagreement. They were essentially debating the nature of American masculinity and the role of heroes in popular culture. "Here's what we're going to do," Eastwood said suddenly, his decision clearly made. "We're going to test your theory. We're both going to make our version of this story, and we'll see which one audiences prefer." Harrison was taken aback by the suggestion. "You want to make two separate movies from the same script?" "I want to prove a point," Eastwood said. "You make your version with all the talking and explaining and emotional hand-holding you want. I'll make mine the right way, where actions matter more than words, and men are judged by what they do, not what they say." The challenge was unprecedented in Hollywood history. Two major stars essentially agreeing to make competing versions of the same story, to prove their respective points about heroism and storytelling. "Fine," Harrison said, extending his hand. "But when my version outperforms yours, I want you to admit that audiences prefer heroes they can actually relate to." "And when mine shows you what real filmmaking looks like," Eastwood replied, shaking Harrison's hand with a grip like iron, "you can go back to making kids' movies." The deal they struck that day would never actually be implemented. Studio executives quickly realized that having two major stars make competing movies would be a financial disaster. But word of their confrontation spread quickly through Hollywood, and soon every filmmaker, actor, and executive was forced to choose sides in what became known as the Ford-Eastwood War. The battle lines were clear. Team Eastwood included directors like Don Siegel and Sergio Leone, actors like Gene Hackman and Lee Van Cleef, and critics who championed auteur filmmaking and moral complexity. Team Ford included Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and a new generation of filmmakers who believed in accessible heroes and emotionally satisfying narratives. The influence of their philosophical divide can be seen in every action movie made in the late 1980s and beyond. Eastwood's approach influenced films like Blade Runner, The Terminator, and later the Bourne series, stories about morally ambiguous protagonists who operate outside conventional society. Harrison's philosophy shaped the Indiana Jones sequels, the Star Wars prequels, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe adventures featuring heroes who succeed through collaboration and maintain clear moral codes. But perhaps the most important battleground was in the Western genre itself. Eastwood's Unforgiven, released in 1992, was his definitive statement about the cost of violence and the myth of the Western hero. Harrison never did get to make his competing Western, but his influence can be seen in films like Young Guns and Tombstone, Westerns that emphasized character relationships and moral clarity. The irony of their rivalry is that both men were ultimately proved right. Audiences demonstrated appetite for both approaches to heroism, depending on the story being told and the cultural moment. Eastwood's introspective, morally complex heroes appealed to viewers who wanted sophistication and psychological realism. Harrison's emotionally accessible, collaborative heroes satisfied audiences who wanted inspiration and clear moral guidance. Their battle also highlighted the generational tensions that constantly reshape Hollywood. Eastwood represented the classical tradition of American filmmaking, spare, violent, and psychologically complex. Harrison embodied the emerging blockbuster mentality, spectacular, optimistic, and broadly appealing. Years later, both men came to respect what they had learned from their conflict. Eastwood's later films showed more emotional vulnerability and collaborative heroism. Harrison's performances developed more moral complexity and psychological depth. "Clint taught me that silence can be more powerful than dialogue," Harrison reflected in a 2010 interview. "He showed me that audiences are smart enough to understand subtext without having everything explained to them. Ford reminded me that heroes need to be relatable," Eastwood admitted in his own interview. He proved that showing emotion doesn't make a character weak, it makes them human. Their epic battle ultimately enriched both their careers and the action genre as a whole. Instead of proving that one approach was superior to the other, their rivalry demonstrated that great action cinema could embrace both philosophies, sometimes even within the same film. The legacy of the Ford-Eastwood War can be seen in modern action movies that successfully blend both approaches. Characters like Batman combine Eastwood's moral ambiguity with Ford's emotional accessibility. The John Wick series features Eastwood's taciturn professionalism alongside Ford's clear moral stakes. Even the Marvel Cinematic Universe finds ways to incorporate both collaborative heroism and lone wolf complexity. Today, both men are recognized as defining figures in action cinema, but their 1985 confrontation forced Hollywood to grapple with fundamental questions about heroism, violence, and the responsibility of popular entertainment. Their battle wasn't just about two actors competing for a role, it was about the soul of American action movies. Harrison Ford's epic battle with Clint Eastwood proved that the best creative conflicts are those that force both sides to examine their assumptions and push their artistry to new levels. Instead of destroying each other, their rivalry elevated both men and enriched the entire genre they were fighting over. In the end, their Western showdown did change action movies forever, not by establishing one vision as superior, but by proving that great cinema emerges from the tension between competing philosophies, each offering something valuable that the other lacks. Sometimes the most important battles aren't won or lost, they're simply fought with enough passion and integrity to make everyone involved better at their craft.